Good afternoon and Happy New Year. Welcome to today's OSC Registrant Outreach webinar entitled National Registration Database, NRD 101. I am one of your presenters today. My name is Jenny Salin Sang. I am a registration supervisor and a member of the registration team in the Compliance and Registrant Regulation branch at the Ontario Securities Commission. Joining me today is my colleague and co-presenter, Tanvir Tahir, Senior Business Analyst, who is a member of the Data Strategy and Risk Team in the Compliance and Registrant Regulation branch at the Ontario Securities Commission. Before we begin, here is our standard disclaimer for all presentations. Here's our agenda for today. Part 1, we intend to provide an overview, or basically an introduction of the National Registration Database, or NRD system. In Part 2, we plan to cover the most common issues experienced by users or authorized firm representatives, AFRs, and we would like to provide tips to assist AFRs with these issues. In Part 3, we will discuss the fees collected through NRD. And lastly, Part 4, we will outline the common reports which one can generate on NRD. We will provide contact information and resources near the end of this presentation, followed by a question and answer period, which will bring us to the conclusion of this presentation. During the course of this presentation, please feel free to submit your questions using the chat feature on GoToMyWebinar. We are hopeful that this presentation will be informative for someone new to NRD, or it will be a nice refresher for our seasoned NRD users. So here we go. Part 1. Overview of the National Registration Database. Here's a screenshot of what you would see on the splash page of the NRD website. When you click on either language, it will take you to the login page. What is NRD? The National Registration Database, or the acronym NRD, which we will be using throughout this presentation, is an electronic database containing registration information for firms such as dealers, advisors, investment fund managers, and underwriters, and also individuals registered under securities or commodities futures legislation in Canada, and under IROC rules or bylaws, or who are otherwise required by such legislation to submit registration information to regulators. But it is also a system used by applicants and registrants to electronically submit certain applications, notices, and other registration information to regulators for review. This system contains registration information with respect to all Canadian jurisdictions. And here is the website address as displayed. NRD information website. Now, when NRD became operational in March 2003, there was another website established to help firms and authorized firm representatives, which we will cover off soon, to use NRD more effectively so that NRD could be more user-friendly. This information website is extremely useful. And trust me, as a regulator, I have and continue to use this site frequently. So if you are new to NRD, it would be very beneficial for you to check it out. And here's the website address as displayed. If you are not already familiar with this information website, there is a section called User Guide on the left-hand navigational toolbar. And this section provides step-by-step reference guides or instructions in PDF on how to file certain submissions on NRD. Canadian Securities Administrators, CSA National Registration Search. Not everyone has access to NRD, especially the general public and investors. So this website provides a search tool where anyone with internet access can check to see if a firm or individual is actually registered, in which jurisdictions, the registration categories, and if any terms and conditions have been imposed on the registration of the firm and/or the individual. Please note the information on the CSA National Registration Search is taken from the NRD website, and the information is refreshed on a daily basis. And here's a screenshot of what the CSA National Registration Search looks like. Here's a flowchart of who should be contacted for questions, inquiries, or issues related to NRD or general registration related questions. Let's keep in mind that the Ontario Securities Commission, or OSC, would be the firm's or individual's principal regulator in these cases. First, if your question or inquiry is related to a particular submission filed on NRD, please contact the reviewer or registration officer by clicking on the name of the reviewer under the Sent to Regulators tab. The name and the contact information of the reviewer will be displayed. Second, For any questions or inquiries related to technical issues or problems, such as an error message or inability to file a submission, which one experiences on NRD, contact the CSA Service Desk or the NRD Administrator. Note, in the past, the CSA Service Desk has also been referred to as the NRD Help Desk. Lastly, for any general registration-related inquiries or questions, such as obtaining one's NRD number or general proficiency-related questions, please contact the OSC Inquiries and Contact Center. One of our inquiries officers will be happy and able to assist you. Please note, slide 72, under the Contact Information and Resources section, will have the contact information for the CSA Service Desk, or NRD Administrator, as well as the OSC Inquiries and Contact Center. Authorized Firm Representative, AFR. Earlier, I had referred to a user of the NRD system as an Authorized Firm Representative, or an AFR. An AFR is an individual who has been authorized or granted access by a firm's chief AFR to access information and make submissions to regulators with respect to that firm and the individuals associated with that firm. So there are actually 4 types of an AFR when one uses NRD. The first one is Chief Authorized Firm Representative, Chief AFR or CAFR. This is the highest ranking authorized firm representative at a firm. And thus, this individual has the highest responsibility among all AFRs of the firm. A chief AFR can perform all NRD functions which an AFR administrator and an AFR can perform, plus some additional functions which Tanvir will cover off later. Second, an authorized firm representative administrator, AFR administrator or AAFR. An AFR administrator can perform all the same NRD functions as a chief AFR, so there is no functional difference between a chief AFR and an AFR administrator on NRD. However, the difference in these 2 roles is actually in their activities and responsibilities outside of NRD. For example, it is a chief AFR who is contacted by the NRD administrator at CSA Service Desk on questions regarding payment of annual fees. The chief AFR is the first point of contact between the firm and the NRD administrator. It is important to note that only the NRD administrator at CSA Service Desk has the ability to change a chief AFR of the firm. Third, authorized firm representative, AFR. An AFR has access to the system for the purposes of performing basic functions of an authorized firm representative, such as making submissions on behalf of the firm and individuals associated with the firm, as well as searching for and viewing information on NRD. And lastly, individual applicant. An individual applicant may be assigned a user ID and a password by an AFR for the purposes of completing their own submission for initial registration. The individual applicant only has access to their own submission in the Work in Progress tab. When the individual completes a submission and sends it to the AFR, their user ID or access to NRD in general is automatically revoked. NRD numbers. An NRD number is a unique number generated by NRD to identify a firm, individual, or business location. First, a firm's NRD number is generated by the system when the NRD administrator creates its record on the system as part of the firm's NRD enrollment process. Please note that firm NRD numbers end in the number 0. Second, an individual NRD number will be generated by the system for an individual when an AFR creates an initial registration submission for that individual. This NRD number is assigned to the individual even before the AFR sends this submission to the regulators. However, one cannot search for an individual's NRD number until the initial submission is approved, since there is no permanent record for that individual. Please note that individual NRD numbers end in the number 1. Third, a business location NRD number is generated by the system for a business location when you first create a submission to open a location, Form 33-109F3. This NRD number is assigned to the business location even before you send the submission to regulators. This number can also be used to retrieve location information during a search or during certain firm and individual submissions. For example, location address change, employment location change, etc. Please note that business location NRD numbers end in the number 2. And lastly, the system assigns each NRD submission, such as an initial, reactivation, reinstatement, notice, an NRD number. The system assigns this number when an AFR creates the submission. This number can be reviewed through the Work in Progress, Sent to Regulator tabs, and individual search function, which Tanvir will explain later. AFRs are able to perform searches by submission number. Also note that each time a submission is filed for review by regulators and subsequently returned for additional reviews, a new NRD submission number will be assigned each time. Historically, before NRD had become operational in March 2003, a decision had been made that information pertaining to an individual's registration, and thus an application for registration for an individual applicant in Form 33109F4, was the most essential and paramount. And that is the reason why information for firms are predominantly not filed via NRD for review by regulators. In summary, this outlines the registration information and applications submitted to regulators using NRD. So related to an individual, applications for registration such as initial, reactivation, reinstatement, applications for exemption from proficiency or experience requirements applicable to registered individuals. You may use NRD for this application only if the individual in question is associated with your firm on NRD. Notice of any changes to an individual's information. Notice of termination of an individual's employment, Form 33-109F1. A surrender or change of individual categories, Form 33-109F2. Notice to exclude individuals from the annual fee calculation. And related to a firm, information regarding a firm's location, other than head office, changing information pertaining to the firm's branch and sub-branch locations by filing Form 33-109F3. And lastly, annual fee exclusion and reversal. Now here's a summary of the registration information and applications which are not submitted to regulators using NRD. Related to an individual, any supporting documents required to accompany an individual's application for registration, for example, financial disclosure. And related to a firm, an application for registration as a dealer, advisor, investment fund manager, and/or underwriter on Form 33-109F6. Registration categories under the Securities Act, Ontario, or on Form 33-506F6. Registration categories under the Commodity Futures Act, Ontario, and all supporting documents in connection with such an application. Notice of any change to a firm's registration information contained on Form 33-109F6 by filing a Form 33-109F5, change in registration information, which includes a firm's head office information. An application to voluntarily surrender a firm's registration, a notice of amalgamation or merger of a firm with another firm, an application for membership with IROC or the MFDA, NRS Form 31-101F1, election to use the NRS and determination of principal regulator, and lastly, NRS Form 31-101F2, notice of change. Which leads us to a question. If this information or applications are not filed via NRD, as indicated on the previous slide, then how is it filed? If the OSC is the firm's principal regulator, then this information or application is filed with us by using a completed form, such as Form 33-109F6 or Form 33-109F5. Or if there's no applicable form, such as a voluntary surrender application, then it's typically filed via cover letter, which is electronically uploaded, typically in PDF format, via the OSC electronic filing portal, or what we commonly refer to as our e-portal. Here is a link to the OSC website and the reference to OSC Rule 11-501, electronic delivery of documents to the Ontario Securities Commission, which came into effect on February 19th, 2014. Now Tanvir will take us through navigating the NRD website.
Thanks, Jenny. Over the next few slides, we'll cover what you as a CAFR, AFR, or AAFR have access to on NRD. Provided you're registered with one organization, your landing page should look something like this. The links in the bottom area under task menu are the same as what you see on the tabs as well. Under the first tab, firm submission, this is what you have access to submit directly through NRD. For changes in firm categories, CCO, UDP, among other items, I think as Jenny mentioned, you'll need to submit those forms via the generic filing portal. And for other items related to locations or annual fee exclusions, this is this is the area where you submit those. And just a note, you will need to set up categories registration in the appropriate jurisdictions in order to submit these items. Otherwise, you'll get the error message you see here in red. The jurisdictions of the registration for the firm are not yet available. Contact the Securities Regulatory Authority or self-regulatory organization for assistance. Under the next tab, individual submission, you have a few options for submissions, either initial, which refers to an individual's initial registration, but also reactivation and reinstatement, amendments, where you can make changes for an individual, for example, removal of a category or application for exemption, and finally notices, where you can file a notice of termination for an individual or make changes to an individual's items 1 to 17 via form 33-109F5. Under the search function, you can use this to look up any individual or submission related to a firm. This includes any historical submissions submitted by the firm. And applications for individuals must be submitted or approved before you can actually view them on NRD. The next tab, work in progress, this is where you can view any submissions that you're currently working on, and that's fairly self-explanatory. The next tab, sent to regulators, this is where you can view any submissions that yourself have submitted to the regulator, and that appears here. If you don't see your submission here, you can double check the work in progress tab in case you haven't submitted it. And then under the firm information tab, this is where you can view all the document info that's been inputted by the regulators in the firm's NRD profile. And the final tab, your options under admin tools will depend on your role. You can refer to slide 10 for the AFR types, but as an AFR, you can change your password, resubmit fees, or generate reports. And whereas as an AFR administrator or chief AFR, you can revoke access, reset passwords for others, set up individuals, or change AFR data, for example, email addresses, phone numbers, etc., etc. And I will pass it back to Jenny.
So with some inspiration from David Letterman and his top 10 lists, we have decided to organize and present this section in this manner. Drum roll, please. Kidding. Starting off with number 10. AFRs should not leave outstanding submissions in their work in progress tab for a prolonged period of time. Any submission sitting in an AFR's work in progress tab should eventually be filed on NRD for review by regulators, or it should be deleted. If this doesn't happen, outstanding submissions sitting in an AFR's work in progress tab may cause issues for individual applicants when they reapply for registration with another sponsoring firm. This becomes rather awkward because A, an individual may not be aware that there is still an outstanding submission, and B, regulators often have to step in to assist firms with this issue. And number 9, permanent record, form 33-109F4. Until the regulators actually approve a submission, such as a notice, examples being an outside business activity under item 10, current employment, or a course which an individual has completed under item 8, proficiency, an individual's permanent record will not be updated in the system. Number 8 of our top 10. When regulators are reviewing applications, we often find that there are incomplete or inaccurate responses provided in various items in form 33-109F4. These will be marked as deficient, and it could lead to delays in the review process, or it could result in regulatory action being taken. Please review CSA Staff Notice 33-320, the requirement for true and complete applications for registration, and in particular, see the guidance for completing applications. Number 1, read the application form carefully. And number 2, complete the application form truthfully and with candor. Continuing with number 8, here are some examples. Regulators have often noted incomplete or even non-disclosure of required information under these particular items. Item 13, regulatory disclosure. Item 14, criminal disclosure. Note, the questions asked to The questions asked apply to offenses committed in any jurisdiction of Canada and any foreign jurisdiction. Item 16, financial disclosure. In particular, the questions related to bankruptcy, insolvency, or any similar proceeding. Tip, we want to emphasize that AFR should ensure that the individual applicant is reviewing each question under these items, and in the entire application for that matter, carefully in order to provide a truthful and an accurate response, because this could be consequential and it could lead to regulatory action being taken by regulators if warranted. Still with number 8, more examples where regulators have noted deficiencies. Questions 3 and 5 under item 10, current employment, other business activities, officer positions held in directorships. We have found that the level of detail provided by AFRs and ultimately the individual applicant varies greatly, and perhaps this is related or connected to the registration category or permitted individual status that one is applying for. Here's a tip. Please ensure that all information which has been asked for or that is required has been disclosed, or this item will be flagged as a deficiency. Another example is question 4 under item 8, proficiency, where it specifically asks about an individual's relevant securities industry experience. Regulators have found that this section is often not completed correctly. Why is it not completed correctly? Well, sometimes this particular section is completely missed, or AFRs indicate NA, not applicable, when it actually should be completed. Please note that relevant securities industry experience is not the same as relevant investment management experience. Refer to sections 3.3 and 3.12 of the companion policy to NI 31103. Now, number 7 of our top 10 lists. Why can't I submit this application via NRD? Error or warning messages in red could appear when an AFR is completing an application on NRD, which is in progress. Tip. An AFR should attempt to resolve this issue by following what has been instructed by the system. Here are some common ones that you may encounter. So we're going to continue with number 7 for the next 4 slides. If the employment activity is with an individual sponsoring firm and not an outside business activity, remember to check off the checkbox in item 10, current employment, other business activities, officer positions held, and directorships. This is often a deficiency noted by regulators. Another example is found under item 8, proficiency. Regulators often note in their review the information specified is inaccurate. For example, an applicant completed the Canadian Securities course exam on a date indicated on their transcript, but then another date is actually specified under this item. So as a tip, use a drop-down menu to select the course examination or designation from a list. However, if the course examination or designation is not specified in the list, you will have to indicate it separately, which leads me to the next slide. Continuing with number 7, for the designations CFA charter and CIM designation in particular, another question is associated with these particular designations, whether the individual is a current member permitted to use the designation. If the correct designation is not selected under item 8, this additional question will not be asked. Still with number 7 of our top 10 list. Please ensure that check marks are received for all items 1 to 17 on Form 33-109F4, as a page-by-page completeness check before following through with the filing of the submission. Here's another tip. Double check that the submission has been filed properly. Check to see that the submission is actually in the AFR's Sent to Regulators tab and not still sitting in the Work in Progress tab. Now moving on to number 6 of our top 10 lists. Regulators come across this during the review. We have noted that AFRs often forget to remove the officer's title specified under Other when a Form 33-109F2 submission is filed to remove permitted individual officer. So here's a tip. And just a reminder that this should be completed because it could lead to some confusion under an individual's permanent record. Item 6, registration categories in particular. Number 5 of our top 10 list. AFRs often provide an incorrect response to the question stated under item 5, registration jurisdictions. Here's a screenshot of the question asked. AFR should clearly determine which submissions should be filed via passport or interface and which should not be filed via passport or interface by reviewing the question carefully. Here's a tip. For most submissions filed via NRD, when the firm is registered in more than one jurisdiction, the response to this question is yes. However, the review of individual applications where the individual is only a permitted individual is not reviewed via passport. Regulators often have to return these submissions to the AFR for correction in order that the submission can be reviewed properly. However, sometimes there are exceptions where the regulators may accept that the submission is reviewed by passport when it technically should not be. Number 4 of our list, avoid being charged a fee or an additional fee. The effective date should typically be the date the submission is made to avoid late fees. When a submission is refiled for review, select, is this related to a deficient submission to avoid being charged an additional fee? In some circumstances, the OSC will consider issuing a refund. An NRD refund application, called NRD Request for Refund form, must be completed and submitted to the regulators for consideration. This form can be found under the heading Obtaining Refunds in the Using NRD section found on the NRD Information website. And number 3 of our top 10 list. Okay, so what is the difference between a reinstatement of registration versus a reactivation of registration? When an individual wants to transfer one's registration from their previous sponsoring firm to a new sponsoring firm and wants to start carrying out registrable activities immediately at the new sponsoring firm, then a reinstatement of registration, Form 33-109F7, can be filed for the regulator's review. However, it is important to note that submitting this form on NRD is not an automatic approval. An individual must meet all of these criteria to be eligible to file a reinstatement of registration. Form 33-109F7 is submitted via NRD on or before the 90th day after the secession date from a previous sponsoring firm. There are no issues with an individual's termination from the previous sponsoring firm, such as an allegation of criminal activity, breach of securities legislation, or breach of a rule of an SRO. There are no changes to items 13 through to 16, except for 13.3A of the individual's Form 33-109F4 after the secession date from a previous sponsoring firm. The individual is seeking reinstatement in one or more of the same registration categories in which he or she was previously registered. And finally, the individual's new sponsoring firm is registered in the same categories of registration as the individual's former sponsoring firm. Continuing with number 3 for the next 3 slides. Please note that the eligibility for an individual to use a reinstatement of registration application will be changing under the proposed amendments to NI 33-109. And subject to ministerial approval, these amendments will come into force on June 6th of this year. Here's a great opportunity for us to inform you that our next registrant outreach session is scheduled this March, and it will be discussing the recent amendments to NI 33-109 to modernize registration information requirements, clarify outside activity reporting, and update filing deadlines. So please register to attend this webinar. For reference purposes, please refer to Annex C, the FAQs on updating registration information on NRD in the amendments to NI 33-109, which was published on the OSC website on December 16th of last year. Still continuing with number 3, here's an interesting tidbit. The approval date of certain individual submissions, such as a reinstatement of registration and a registration in an additional jurisdiction, will typically be backdated to the date that the submission had originally been filed via NRD for review by the regulators. However, for applications such as an initial registration and a reactivation of registration, the approval date is the actual date that the regulators approved the submission. Of course, we encourage AFRs to check this information under item 6, registration categories, under an individual's permanent record once the submission has been approved. And still with number 3, we've covered off what a reinstatement of registration is, but what is a reactivation of registration? Well, if it is not an initial registration application, thus the individual has an existing active NRD number assigned, or the individual is not eligible to file a reinstatement of registration, because the criteria has not been met, then a reactivation of registration application must be filed by NRD for review. A reactivation is similar to an initial registration application. However, an individual's pre-existing information is already on NRD under items 1 through to 17, and each item should be reviewed to see if the information required must be updated. Number 2 of our top 10 list. If you want to receive a check mark for these particular items, then no gaps, please. For applications such as an initial registration or reactivation of registration, under item 2, which is residential address, and item 11, which is previous employment, an individual is required to disclose information for the past 10 years from the date the application was filed without any gaps. Please note AFRs will receive an error message detecting gaps if this is not completed correctly, and the system will not permit an application or notice to be filed under these particular items. And the number 1 issue, which made our top 10 list, here's a screenshot. If you see this error message, there is an individual on the system with the same name and date of birth as the applicant. This is a system informing the AFR that the individual might already have an existing NRD number. So an individual should only have one NRD number assigned to them, so they do not have a duplicate permanent record in the system. Sometimes this error message will appear when an individual has an inactive NRD number, because the application has been previously filed by NRD for review by the regulators, but it was not actually approved. Contact the OSC Inquiries and Contact Center, referred to slide 72, to confirm if the individual has an existing NRD number. Now I'll turn this over to Tanvir to discuss other notable NRD issues and tips which did not make our top 10 list.
Thanks, Jenny. As Jenny mentioned, we'll go through some other notable NRD issues which didn't make the top 10 list. Some of these include password issues. Solutions to your password issues really depend on your role. For example, if you're a chief AFR, you'll need to connect with the CSA service desk that can reset your password, but you must know your PIN. If you've managed to lose or forgot your PIN, you'll need to contact the CSA service desk for further help. If you're an AFR, you can rely on your chief AFR to help reset your password. And if you're an individual applicant, they can connect with the AFR who helped set up their account in the first place. And if you need further help, there's some contact information at the bottom of the slide here. Banking information. If you'd like to remove any of the banking information associated with your firm, you can forward your request to your PR, who will forward it to the CSA service desk. Just note, if you're planning to add a bank account, however, you'll need to submit forms 1, 2, and 3, plus a $500 enrollment fee as a part of the firm enrollment process. Finding and tracking submissions. So this is a fairly common occurrence where the firm can't complete a submission for an individual because of an open submission elsewhere. And Jenny alluded to this earlier as well, but here's a few things you can do on your end before contacting your regulator. First thing is you can check the work in progress tab. Occasionally, if you're working on a lot of submissions, there could be potentially an existing one for that same individual. Another thing you can do, provided it's okay with the individual you're registering, and if they're comfortable disclosing the information, you can ask them if they work with other firms and other sponsoring firms, and see if there are any open submissions with the other firms. And finally, occasionally, if the submission is too old and it is within your form, you'll need to contact your CAFR or AFR administrator, who needs to look up the submission, and then they'll need to reassign it to any of the active AFR. And the last resort is you can follow up with your regulator, since they may be able to identify any open submissions in the back end, and we can sort of find specifically what submissions are open. In terms of other areas the submission may have gone to, it may have already been sent to the regulators by accident, and which is why it's no longer showing in your WIP. So you could check the Sent to Regulators tab, Otherwise, it may have been returned to the firm after submitting it to the regulator if you didn't get notice of it from the regulator themselves. So you just need to check your WIP or your work in progress tab to correct any deficiencies. Updating locations. Occasionally you'll come across an individual who want to, you may need to update their location of employment. If they were a permitted individual and then they're registering in other categories as well. In this case, you'll be met with a blank screen here that you can see on the left side of the screen with a NA and a checkbox grayed out. All you need to do here is press cancel, and then you'll be prompted with a form where you can enter information, add the appropriate information for the location of employment. Data zaps. Data zaps are exactly what they sound like. It's you're effectively modifying the data that's been submitted and approved on NRD. It's a correction and edit that's done by the vendor, CGI, and it does come at a cost. So occasionally, and this mostly occurs with dates of registration, but it may also happen elsewhere as well. So anytime, and we understand this as well, that mistakes can happen during the submission process, though we encourage everyone to carefully review where possible. But in the event a date is incorrectly listed, there are two options. As mentioned, a data zap is where CGI corrects the date, though it may take some time given CGI's other priorities, maintaining NRD, and it is costly for the CSA as well. Otherwise, the other option is a regulatory note. If the data itself is inconsequential, the regulators may be able to apply a regulatory note instead on NRD, explaining why the error occurred and the actual correct date. The temporary hardship exemption filings are available if you're unable to make submission within a certain time frame due to technical issues. And this process is outlined in Section 5.1 of National Instrument 31102, National Registration Database. And if you're having a hard time finding the information or where to submit the appropriate information, you can contact your regulator as well. So the next section, we'll briefly go over some fees that are collected through NRD. So currently there are several types of fees that are collected to cover the cost of operating and enhancing NRD. And these fees are collected via electronic funds transfer, EFT. There are two types of fees specific to NRD, and this includes NRD submission fees and annual NRD system fees. And then there are participation fees that are specific to the OSC. So the NRD system fee occurs when any of the following happen: an initial registration, a registration in an additional jurisdiction, and a reactivation. And the system will, the fees will differ based on PR and additional jurisdictions. You can see the information here, and you can also find the information on nrdinfo.ca as well. And the other type of fee are the annual NRD system fees, and I won't go through the specific numbers here, but you can see these are collected on December 31st as a payment for the following year. And again, these are just based on how many individuals you're registering within the PR plus additional jurisdictions. And now I'll pass it to Jenny to go over regulatory and participation fees.
Regulatory fees and participation fees. All registered firms, unregistered investment fund managers, and unregistered exempt international firms, such as international dealers and international advisors, are required to pay regulatory fees. These could be submission specific, based on each application filed, which is outlined under the activity fees section, or an annual fee. Each regulator will charge fees based on their rules or fee schedule. Refer to the regulatory fees section on the NRD information website. See slide 5. We refer to this as a participation fee in Ontario, which is calculated in accordance with our fee rules. Please refer to OSC Rule 13-502 fees and OSC Rule 13-503 Commodity Futures Act fees, and the link to these rules on the OSC website. Typically, for certain submissions filed on NRD, the fee will be charged automatically upon filing the submission with the regulators in accordance with our fee rules. However, the resubmit fee payment function permits AFRs to submit fees manually to regulators. Thus, these fees are not automatically pulled or withdrawn from a firm's bank account, but the AFR is instructing the regulators to withdraw this particular amount. And here's a screenshot of what this looks like under the Admin Tools tab. Under the resubmit payment function, there are two selections. One, correct a default EFT payment. This is used to resubmit fees that were rejected or returned. For example, NSF. It will accumulate all rejected return fees until paid. It will resubmit all rejected return fees to parties originally specified. And number two, resubmit funds related to a submission. This is used to submit fees where NRD does not automatically pull fees. For example, exemption applications, late fees, payment of fees related to firm applications, such as new business applications or firms adding a jurisdiction to its existing registration. Note, the regulators will provide an NRD submission number to the AFR, and AFRs must specify each jurisdiction and amount. And here's a screenshot of what this looks like for option 2, where the submission number is indicated at the top, and then the fee recipient is selected from the drop-down menu, and the submission fee amount is specified, and the reason for payment of the fees is also indicated. Annual fee exclusion. All regulators have a mechanism in place where annual fees are pulled from the firm's bank account by December 31st of each year. This annual fee exclusion process ensures that a firm is not charged annual fees for individuals surrendering or terminating their registration by December 31st. So individuals often work up until December 31st, and then a notice of termination, a form 33-109F1, cannot be filed by NRD until after this date. If the individual is actively registered on NRD, then applicable fees will be charged by each jurisdiction where the individual is registered. So one submission can be filed for multiple individuals per jurisdiction. Note, this process can be reversed. This annual fee exclusion must be filed by 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on December 31st, and the individual's notice of termination, form 33-109F1, must be filed within 10 days of their actual termination date. The NRD information website has more detailed information about this process, step by step. Here's a link as displayed. Next, Tanvir will discuss how to generate reports on NRD.
So now we'll move on to part 4, commonly generated reports. On NRD, you have access to generating a variety of different reports, and you can see the full list here. We're not going to go through the entire list. Instead, we'll go through some of the more commonly generated ones, which AFR can produce on NRD under the Admin Tools tab. And these include generate reconciliation report by EFT, list registrants, and generate 33-109F1 report. So the generating reconciliation report by EFT shows you all the transactions involving your firm's bank account. You can only generate 2 months of payment information, and you can filter it by the status, whether it's been paid, withdrawn, etc. And you can also generate it by jurisdiction as well. And here's just an example of the output. the most sort of the most common place to look is under payment type, and you can also review what the payment was related to as well. The next report is the list registrants report, which generates a list of individuals that are registered to the firm. And there are several filtering options. The first step here is to figure out what jurisdiction you want to generate the list of individuals for. You can do this by jurisdiction or by employment location NRD number. And you can see here there are further options by depending on what registration categories the firm is currently registered in. And you could also filter it by active or inactive individuals as well. And you can see the output here. You can view all the information of an individual, including their location, jurisdiction, status, categories, and officer titles if applicable. The third report, 33109F1, report lists the termination report for an individual. All you need here is an NRD number. And here you can see the output for the 33109F1 report, which lists the termination report for an individual. Here you can see all the responses provided when you or the individual filled out the 33109F1 report. In terms of report formats, all reports except for the one I just discussed, the 33109F1, provide you output options including PDF, CSV, and Excel. The 33109F1 report has a PDF-only output. Finally, this is sort of related to the list registrants report. We've had a few requests over the past year about this, where a firm would want to generate a permanent record report for an individual restaurant. This sort of lists the individual plus all the information listed from items 1 to 17. There's no batch generation option. You'd need to download the permanent record for an individual restaurant one by one. So just a note on that. And finally, if a report takes too long to generate, you'll find a message like this where it says your report has been scheduled successfully, but it's not ready for retrieval. It will be report number listed, and then you could retrieve your report later on. So using the report number provided by NRD, you can generate the report whenever it's ready. But though once the report is ready, it will come up in a PDF format, though it might come up in other formats as well, depending on what you selected in the report format criteria. And now I'll pass it over to Jenny to go over the remaining portions of the presentation.
Thanks, Tanvir. Now here is the contact information for our CSA Service Desk, or NRD Administrator, and the OSC Inquiries and Contact Center. To reiterate what had been discussed earlier on slide 9, any technical questions, inquiries, or problems related to the NRD system, these should be directed to the CSA Service Desk and/or the NRD Administrator. For all general registration-related inquiries or questions, such as how to obtain one's NRD number, or general proficiency-related questions, an inquiries officer in our OSC Inquiries and Contact Center would be happy to assist you. Here are the resources, including hyperlinks, to the various rules and staff notices on the OSC website, which had been referred to during this presentation.